Okay, let's try this review one more time. I forgot to have my mic on last time, so a couple of other orders of business. I changed the title of this channel to Talking into the Void, because I feel that's what I do when I'm on the internet, no matter what medium. So I guess the series will also be called. And I've also noticed that I tend to wear this t-shirt and this hoodie when I film videos. It's not on purpose, it just seems to be the days I feel like filming, also days I wear this. But I also really like this t-shirt, and this is my usual hoodie. So today I'll be doing a review of No Way Home. Now, I'm going to have to go to spoilers later, but first I'm going to do a spoiler-free review, and I'll just be general thoughts and feelings. So, I generally liked this film, which surprised me because I did not like Far From Home. And Far From Home had actually kind of soured me on the MCU Peter Parker completely. So I went in not expecting much from this film, and I was very, very surprised by how much I liked it. This film had heart, it had weight. The other films had heart and weight too, but this one, it felt more like a Spider-Man film. And I just liked the bits of nostalgia. I feel like the first act dragged a little, but other than that, it was a very good film. And once it got going, the pace was nice and it just built and satisfying climax. So I do recommend this film. Now, here's your spoiler warning. So, it's going to get spoiler territory from here on out. So if you do not want to be spoiled for this film, and if you haven't seen it, I was just going to see it, this is the time to click out of this video. Alright, Mr. Bebe. If you're all gone, those who do not want to be spoiled, let us continue. So, I was very apprehensive for No Way Home because Far From Home, the whole thing just left me feeling hollow by the end. I felt like it did not feel like a Spider-Man movie because honestly, it's okay for them to put Spider-Man in other places in his crossover outings, but in his solo outings, I think he's best left in New York. As then he's not a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man if he's elsewhere. He's the globe-trotting Spider-Man, and that's not his tagline. So, what else can I say aside from I just think the location in Far From Home was a mistake. The Iron Manification of another Spider-Man villain was a mistake, and one of the Sinister Six, no less. Honestly, because they brought up the number of Spider-Man villains that they turned to Iron Man villains to four, which mean how Vulture and his crew, which included Tinkerer and Shocker, in that first film, Homecoming, were now stepped down Iron Man villains as they're pissed off at Tony Stark for scooping their cleaning contracts. And now Mysterio is mad because Tony Stark took his invention, named it Barf, and then fired him. And honestly, I think the guy does have a right to be mad about the naming thing. Though firing and not getting his invention, that's just par for the course if you work for a company. But still, after that, after I left Far From Home, I think I remember snarkily saying to my friend, "Gee, I can't wait to see how they have Doc Ock mad at Tony Stark." I am pleasantly surprised and happy to report that doesn't happen. So, something I don't like about the MCU Peter that they did rectify in this film was he was Iron Man light. Getting his stuff from Iron Man, getting his tech from Iron Man, I felt that just was wrong. Because Peter's always been a make it himself kind of guy. Because that's what I liked about Spider-Man growing up, was Peter would use his smarts and his powers and his sense of right and wrong to fight crime. He didn't have someone else come along and make the technology for him. The part of Homecoming I liked the best was I remember Peter had to go back to basics and use his own costume, his own equipment, and his own wits to stop Vulture. And this film was able to fix a lot of that. So the first act of the film was the one that I did not like very much. I thought it dragged. Yes, I get they have to establish the aftermath of the ending of Far From Home with Jameson revealing Peter's identity to the world and all that sort of stuff. Because Mysterio had done an excellent smear campaign in the making with his edited video, which I don't know how he could do that while dying. Like, it's like I guess I'll suspend my disbelief for a couple of seconds because he was supposed to be a special effects genius in the comics. So I guess I'll give him that, even though it looks like he had a whole team behind him, and maybe the team edited it while he was dying. I don't know. All I know is that Peter's life has gone to crap, and I knew they had to show that. But I felt like they could have trimmed it a bit, because it felt like it dragged. And something else that I think showed the bad Iron Man influence on Peter was that he went for a nuclear option with magic than simply calling and pleading his case. But in Peter's defense, whenever Stephen gets mad, rightly so that Peter didn't even think to do that, I didn't know you could do that either, and I have 2 college degrees. So, to be fair to Peter, I don't blame him for not knowing he could do that. But in that whole case there, well, MIT does have maybe some reason to not want Peter there, because as a superhero, he could attract supervillains. They could plead safety hazard, for campus. They had no right to exclude Ned or Michelle, because they are just friends with him. They didn't technically do anything public-facing, aiding and abetting, especially not with the whole Mysterio thing. So for MIT to send them letters like that of, well, you are a controversial figure to them, I think that the characters of Michelle and Ned had the perfect grounds for a lawsuit, and they should have gone for it too. Furthermore, they could have very savvily played into the fact that Ned and Michelle in this universe are both people of color, and that could have also been a very bad look for MIT to not admit them for something that isn't their fault, because they're not Spider-Man. They're just his friends. And you really should not be doing guilt by association, especially not in this day and age, because who knows who's going to sue. So I think that actually should have been more of an option, but this is a action hero superhero film, so speaking of lawyers, it was very pleasant to see Matt Murdock brought into the MCU like that. I did enjoy him catching the rubber, like, whoa, how'd you do that? Because he's Daredevil, that's why. So Matt Murdock showing up was a nice little cameo. So, back to the kids, though. That was actually an improvement in this film. In the previous films, I didn't like Michelle in Homecoming. I didn't like Ned in Far From Home. This is the first film where I've liked both of the kids' side characters, because them and Peter actually felt like a friend unit in this one. Now, in Far From Home was just a giant mistake in a lot of its form. To quote Three Amigos, they messed with the formula. Spider-Man needs to be in New York, not on a European vacation. That's like the ultimate mistake of that film, was they should not have done that. Or it should have just been Peter by himself. Because Ned was superfluous, and MJ only really helped a little bit towards the end of the second act and part of the third act. But Ned was just worthless. And his whole little romantic side plot that went nowhere was also worthless and waste of time. And I'm not going to go into the whole Far From Home thing. Let's just say I have a lot of issues with that film, and I don't want to get into them in a No Way Home review. So the kids' chemistry was better in this film. Let's get into something else. The second thing I really loved in this film, the bridge scene and the introduction of the bad guys. So the trailer made it look like that Goblin and Octopus were working together and they appeared together. But that was a nice little bit of editing. It also made it look like Doc Ock said, "Hello, Peter," to the Holland Parker without having a reason to know that was Peter Parker. Him appearing after he's suited up and in the smoke and then starts fighting him is a very clever way to prolong the whole he doesn't know he's not dealing with his Peter moments, which I thought was both glorious and hilarious. Like, you're not Peter Parker. Yes, I am. That bit was actually just wonderful for me. But I also have to wonder, well, he did admire the nanotech for a second after he pulled it off and it somehow merged with tentacles. I don't know how that happened. I don't think that's how it should have happened. But I don't know enough about nanotechnology to disagree. It still made a nice little backfire moment for him whenever the Holland Parker was able to type away at the interface and hijack his tentacle arms. That was a nice little voiced by his own petard moment. But it did give me pause for like, why did he think? Why isn't he questioning the nanotech more? Because he came from, I think, Spider-Man 2 came out in 2004, 2003, 2004. I'm gonna say 2004, and there's no way they had that sort of technology in even in Marvel 2004. So the fact that he didn't question it was like, but and the fact he also didn't notice that he was dealing with a slightly shorter, slightly slimmer in the shoulders Spider-Man. Though I will give him a pass that maybe the shiny suit was that distracting. But the fact that each and every villain was like, "You're not Peter Parker," and it's like, "Yes, I am." Something else I quite enjoyed with the Doc Ock interactions with Peter and his friends was when he gives the kids his name. They're like, "Nah, what's your real name?" And he's like, "Really is that?" And the kids, and that's the moment where I felt like they were a proper group of 17-year-olds laugh at the name. Because honestly, the first time you hear Otto Octavius' name, you do want to giggle a little. Because it's a ridiculous name. And I thought the kids just bursting out laughing at his name was perfectly on brand for a group of teenagers. But something else I liked about the bad guys was with Electro's redesign, and that was a redeem point. Sometimes whenever he'd use electricity, you'd see the flash around his face, and it'd actually look a bit like his actual comic book counterpart's mask, and I loved that. I liked all the other little nods they did, especially with Norman when he's in his cell saying, I'm something of a scientist myself, and I giggled at that because that's been memed and it's been all over the place. It was nice to see them do that sort of nod, and they did not overdo the nostalgia, which can happen. Like I liked Ghostbusters Afterlife, but they had moments where they went way too hard on nostalgia. Whereas this movie actually knew how to pull it back just enough. And when it came to Lizard speaking, I actually had to agree with the kids. I didn't know he could speak. I'd forgotten he could speak, actually. So the fact that they chose those particular villains, because those were all ones that their respective Peters in their films wanted to save and couldn't. So the fact that this Peter, even though it was the Aunt May character gave him the bug to do it, wanted to save them was very much what Peter Parker would do. And the fact that for a little bit it seemed like he was going to get a no good deed goes unpunished story arc when the villain's sudden but inevitable betrayal happens, especially considering he doesn't know that Norman can play the two-face, two-personality thing. It isn't until Octavius gets his mind back that mentions the no more dark side thing that anyone's even given a hint of what's up with Goblin. And as they're working on doing that, Goblin betrays them, and that's also something of a difference between Norman and Goblin is that's the personalities to me. Their sudden but inevitable betrayal thing. It's like I said, it's almost shaping up to be a no good deed goes unpunished, but then Aunt May gives the line that ensures the character who initially delivers that line is dead. Like when she started saying, "With great power comes great responsibility," I'm like, "Oh crap, May is dead," and it's I think something that some people are going to hate, some people are going to be okay with. I'm in the crowd of I'm okay with it because we didn't get to have Uncle Ben in the MCU, which is another strike against him. So the fact that he's not in the films to give the line, I mean, it does fall appropriately to May to give. And I think it is appropriate in the circumstances we didn't have a Ben. And I certainly wouldn't be happy. And I cannot emphasize how glad I am most of the Iron Man stuff has been stricken from Peter's world by the end of the film. So glad. Um, anyway, so with that in the lowest hour, darkest hour, lowest moment there, and they brought in the other Spider-Men. That was so wonderful, especially considering you see Ned with Doctor Strange's complicated sling ring because they trapped Doctor Strange in the mirror dimension when he wanted to do the logical thing of putting the villains back in their movies right before they die, which Peter didn't want to do because that basically is the same as killing them because they could have saved them. Sorry, I'm getting over cold. And the whole thing with Ned using the sling ring implying sorcerer potential, I suppose, and getting the wrong Peters is hilarious. Especially considering the Peters got pulled through too, because obviously Peter Parker knows he's Spider-Man. And that was an interesting caveat for why these characters pulled through, though it does lead to one weird thing, and I'll get into it at the end because it's at the end anyway. With them showing up and their interactions with the kids initially while they're trying to find their Peter was great. Again, once again, it just showed that they were trying to go for the extreme option whenever using their heads and thinking about it would have found them Peter faster because in that universe they chill out on their school roof to get away from stuff. As the other two Spider-Man mentioned how they would hang out in either the Chrysler Building or the Empire State for their thinking places. The fact that this Peter is still a kid, therefore still grounded in kid ideas and kid stuff, would go to his high school versus a Chrysler Building or a Empire State Building makes sense. But when they show up, they give a great pep talk because they are Peter, so they actually do not. When Peter tries to say, "You don't get to say I know what I'm going through," it's like talking about the death of Aunt May. It's thinking, buddy, if anyone knows what you're going through, it is these two. The fact that these older Peters get to talk to the younger one and give him not only a pep talk but perspective and wisdom of what they've learned the hard way from their lives as Spider-Man. It's very touching. It's a good moment, and it's the perfect way to bounce out of the darkest hour. It is the light out of the darkest hour. I liked how they implied that the Tobey Maguire one and his MJ are happy together, but they didn't fully go into it. I wish I had paid more attention to the Maguire Spider-Man's hands to see if he had a ring or not, but I didn't. So I don't know if he and his MJ actually got married, considering they are making it seem like it has been the amount of time since their actual films debuted that they are into their futures. And Garfield's performance was great, and it's wonderful, and I don't know why people said that the Amazing Spider-Man films weren't good, though I have to say some of their design choices were bad, because I quite enjoyed them. They weren't my favorite. I still actually had a nostalgic preference for the Maguire films, but I don't understand why they were considered the ones that weren't as good. But then again, box office showed that they didn't get a third one, which is a shame. Garfield was pretty good in that role. And maybe, if we're lucky, we'll get another Garfield film from this because it proved that there's still a story there. Though I don't really think we should get any more of Maguire because his arcs finished nicely. His Spider-Man story finished nicely. And this film, it's just like how the three spiders play off each other after they've gotten the youngest Peter pulled out of his rut. And that lab scene was great, especially with them like, oh, wow, how'd you do that? And Maguire Parker not knowing how to explain his spinnerets to the two that have to make their own webs. And then later he's like, oh, you're making fun of me. He's like, no, we generally want to know because our powers don't work like that. And the fact that he doesn't know and never bothered to investigate, I think is pretty hilarious. It's not quite fully in line with Peter because I'm pretty sure he actually would have tried to figure out how that worked. But the fact that he doesn't have to make his own web for it, that the other two are jealous, I thought that was hilarious. And I liked how they were very brotherly with each other after they got over their initial stuff. And the final fight scene had a lot of good moments, a lot of catharsis for each character, especially when they got to see their respective movie villains redeemed, cured, whatever, that they usually got to be the ones witnessing the curing of theirs. And whenever Doc Ock shows up and you think he's on the bad guy side, that the chip did get fried, and then it turns out, no, he's still sane again. And then he helps with taking out Shocker. That was a really good moment too. And the Garfield Spider-Man getting to save someone instead of them dying in because he wasn't fast enough. And Michelle saying, "Are you okay?" And him basically saying no, but he will be. The fact that he got to do the thing that he couldn't before, save the girl, even if it is not his girl, was nice. And the farewell they had with each other, especially considering for a moment I was worried they were going to kill the Maguire Spider-Man. I was like, nah, I've been stabbed before, and true he has. And honestly, with the spider healing, that would not be a fatal wound, not for a Spider-Man. And the fact that they almost had Goblin killed the same way but different after everything was pretty very parallel, very poetic, especially if you, like me, have seen all the other Spider-Man films. And I do take pride in saying I have actually watched the other live-action Spider-Man films. I've seen all of them. It's been a while, but I've seen all of them. The fact that Maguire Spider-Man, who did inadvertently lead to the death of the one guy in the beginning of his film, his first film, the one he thought killed Uncle Ben, scared the guy to the crap, but then the guy tripped and fell out the window to his death. Peter didn't directly kill him, but the fact that he did cause a death, only to be the one to force the other Peter, youngest Peter, to stop before he went too far and regretted it. And then seeing that theme that they almost went with for a little bit, no good deed goes unpunished, being undermined by the fact that even though he saved Goblin and Goblin stabbed him, it still was enough of a moment to get that other Peter down from that rage so that he and Garfield Parker could work together to stop Goblin and cure Norman. It's just very poetic all around and very wholesome. And then when Peter realizes that to save the world, they have to not know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. So he decided to erase himself, Peter Parker, instead of erasing knowledge of Peter Parker being Spider-Man. Because if you don't know who Peter Parker is at all, then it doesn't matter if he's Spider-Man or not. And that sort of sacrifice is so very Peter Parker. It's something that was missing from the other two. Because Peter is a self-sacrificing idiot, but that's why we love him. And the fact that in the beginning thing, when he goes after the Vice Chancellor on that bridge, and he's only trying to get Michelle and Ned reconsidered for it, and not himself, again, is the self-sacrificing idiot that we love. And in the end, I knew he wasn't going to go tell his friends, especially if he saw that they were happy, peaceful with each other without him. No matter how much it hurt, I knew he was just going to accept that the price of their happiness is his, because that's what Peter Parker does. And it was a nice return to form with that. And it was actually a sacrifice, too. With the other films, with Homecoming, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was digging down and realizing that he was more than that fancy schmancy suit that Tony gave him. In Far From Home, the train wreck, there wasn't really a clear message aside from standing on your own 2 feet, which he still technically wasn't doing. But again, Far From Home, I'm not here to bash that in this video completely. This is No Way Home's video. But No Way Home was, I think, the proper reset. And it was almost a way of getting Peter Parker back to basics. No more Tony Stark suits, no more cushy, safe stuff. Back to the Parker look, back to the Peter Parker who sacrifices his personal happiness for the fate of others. Back to what makes Peter Parker Peter Parker. And honestly, that's really what made this film almost the perfect antidote to what Far From Home did in its ending. Well, in its film. The ending was just kind of like a, huh? Wondering where they would go from there, but because it was a Spider-Man story for the first time in the MCU. Granted, they, once again, from what I've heard, hijacked a Miles Morales story because they took Into the Spider-Verse's sort of shtick a little bit. And I could have sworn I read somewhere that Homecoming's plot, aside from the jiggering to make it work in the Peter Parker storyline was actually Miles Morales' plotline. That Ned's closer to the Miles best friend character instead of Peter's normal best friend of Harry Osborn. The normal Osborn doesn't seem to even exist in this MCU, neither does Oscorp. And it's just one of those other weird things I don't understand with the MCU, but they did it. Um, so they actually redeemed everything that was wrong with the MCU Spider-Man with the ending and how they handled this film. Now let's go. So one thing I mentioned earlier, which was there was someone they pulled through that didn't make sense because he doesn't know who Peter Parker is, and that was the Venom Sonyverse Eddie Brock and Venom symbiote. Because I hadn't watched Let There Be Carnage until after I got home after watching No Way Home. So him showing up in the end credit scene I thought was hilarious. I'm like, wait, why is he in this? Are they actually part of the same universe now? Is that what they're doing now? Then he disappeared back to his own universe like the other ones did. I'm like, oh, leaving a bit of the Venom symbiote behind. So that's still a bit of a ooh moment. So when I watched Let There Be Carnage, I saw the mid-credit stinger being Eddie winding up in the other dimension and seeing J. Jonah on the TV. I still have to wonder if the film's parameters of people dragged from other universes knowing Peter Parker's Spider-Man, and he doesn't know that, and I don't think the Venom symbiote knows it either. So why were they dragged through? I guess it's because they wanted a complete roster of all the Raimi-verse and Garfield movies. And I know that the guy who made the movies, I think, was called Webb, actually. Villains cast except for Rhino in the mix. And honestly, I think a tag with Rhino might have been hilarious too. But we can't have everything, can we? But I guess it's just so they could have a Venom cameo and a reason to justify the Venom symbiote in the MCU because he left a bit of himself behind. But it was like the only pull through that didn't make sense. It was still hilarious though to see Eddie in a bar getting like completely drunk, wondering what the heck's going on, and being told about the craziness of the MCU. And before you can even talk to Peter, gets pulled back to Sonyverse, which could be a nice way to explain why he's not directly referenced in Morbius later. He's off in the other universe. So still don't understand how the Michael Keaton character can be in Sonyverse and MCU because it's almost implied that's supposed to be Vulture in both places, but I don't know why he's in both universes. Maybe he has some technology he stole to bounce universes to escape jail. I don't know, but it was still a pretty funny little tag. And the other end credit scene for No Way Home was just a preview for Doctor Strange's film. I didn't touch on Doctor Strange very much because this is about Peter Parker, but I feel like his characterization has been inconsistent at best, and in this film he was very inconsistent. But on the other hand, he was basically right the whole time. And I'm glad they didn't have him sort of take over Tony's role as mentor, because again, this really felt like they were setting the Peter Parker back to the way Peter Parker I think should have been the whole time, which is not being backed by Tony or Tony's gadgets or any of Tony's friends and stuff. I'm sad that it's cost May to do that, but I think this sets up future MCU Spider-Man films to be more true to form. So I heartily recommend No Way Home, and I'm very glad I saw it because I was apprehensive, and I'm glad that my apprehensions were proven wrong.